You have been lied to your entire life about what happiness is, not by one person, by every self-help book, every motivational speaker, every well-meaning parent who ever told you, just find what makes you happy. That single piece of advice has quietly destroyed more lives than most people realize, and today I'm going to show you exactly why. This is Mind Traps, the series where we pull apart the invisible mental frameworks that quietly run your life without your permission. Today's trap is one of the most seductive, the belief that happiness is a destination you're supposed to be moving toward. Psychology has now confirmed what the Stoics suspected 2,000 years ago. There are fundamentally two paths people take toward happiness, and only one of them actually works. The other one is a psychological treadmill. By the end of this video, you will be able to identify which path you're on, why it may be sabotaging your well-being, and what to do instead. But first, you need to understand why we got this so wrong in the first place. Here's what nobody tells you about happiness research. In the 1990s, psychologists identified something they called the hedonic treadmill, also called hedonic adaptation. The idea is straightforward and brutal. Humans rapidly return to a baseline level of happiness after major positive or negative life events. You get the promotion. You feel good for a few weeks. Then it becomes the new normal. You want the next thing. Studies tracking lottery winners found that within a year, their reported happiness had returned to roughly the same level as before the win. The same pattern appeared in reverse. People who suffered serious accidents recovered emotionally far more than outside observers predicted. The brain adapts. It always adapts. Now here is where I'd argue most happiness advice goes completely wrong. Most people hear about hedonic adaptation and conclude, try harder, want better things, set bigger goals. That is precisely the wrong lesson. What this research actually reveals is that the entire architecture of desire-based happiness, I'll be happy when, is structurally broken. It cannot deliver what it promises because the brain is biologically designed to reset. Marcus Aurelius understood this intuitively without the neuroscience. In his Meditations, he wrote about the futility of pursuing external things as sources of inner peace. He didn't say, don't achieve things. He said, don't depend on them for your peace. There is a critical difference. The first path to happiness, let's call it the acquisitive path, is built entirely on that dependency. Get the thing, feel the feeling, want the next thing. It feels like progress. It is a loop. But here's where this gets genuinely disturbing. Researchers discovered something about the acquisitive path that goes beyond mere disappointment. It doesn't just fail to deliver happiness. In many cases, it actively produces the opposite. And the mechanism is something Carl Jung warned about in a completely different context. One that has nothing to do with success and everything to do with identity. Jung spent decades studying what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we suppress, ignore, or deny. But there's a related concept in his work that rarely gets discussed, the persona trap. Jung observed that people who build their entire identity around a role, an achievement, a social image, they don't just become unhappy when that thing is threatened, they become hollow because they outsource their sense of self to something external. Now apply that to the psychology of happiness. When you pursue happiness through acquisition, status, money, relationships, body image, you are not just chasing a feeling, you are constructing a self, and that self is entirely dependent on external validation to feel real. Research in self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward D.C. and Richard Ryan, identifies three core psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Their work found that when people pursue goals for external reasons, to impress others, to gain status, to prove worth, satisfaction from achieving those goals is shallow and short-lived. When people pursue goals for internally aligned reasons, genuine curiosity, personal meaning, authentic connection, well-being is significantly more durable. This is the second path, not the acquisitive path, but what I'll call the integrative path. The Stoics had a name for it: living according to nature, meaning living in alignment with your rational and social nature rather than in reaction to fear and desire. Seneca put it plainly: "It is not that I am brave enough to ignore misfortune. It is that I have removed misfortune's power over my peace." That is not passivity. That is a fundamentally different architecture of identity, one that cannot be stolen by circumstances. I'd argue the critics who dismiss Stoicism as emotionless or cold have missed this entirely. The Stoics were not trying to feel nothing. They were trying to feel freely, without being controlled by what might be taken from them. Now here is the question I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it reframes everything. What if the reason you can't find lasting happiness isn't because you haven't found the right thing yet, but because you've been solving a psychological problem with a logistical solution? Let's get practical, because this matters. The shift from the acquisitive path to the integrative path is not about lowering your ambitions. It is about changing the relationship between your identity and your outcomes. Here is how this works in practice. Psychologists studying post-traumatic growth, the genuine psychological development that can follow severe adversity, consistently find that people who rebuild their lives after loss often report higher life satisfaction than before, not because suffering is good, but because forced detachment from the acquisitive self opens space for a more durable one. You don't have to wait for catastrophe to access that shift. Robert Greene, drawing on historical patterns in the laws of human nature, describes what he calls the death and rebirth dynamic, the deliberate willingness to let go of an old identity before circumstances force you to. Sun Tzu's principle of yielding to overcome applies here psychologically. The person who is not rigidly attached to a specific outcome retains more strategic flexibility and more inner stability. Here are three cognitive moves that research and philosophy both support. First, process investment over outcome attachment. Direct genuine effort and curiosity toward the work itself, not the reward. This is not a cliché. It is what DC and Ryan's research on intrinsic motivation demonstrates repeatedly produces more sustained engagement and well-being. Second, negative visualization, a Stoic practice of deliberately imagining the loss of things you value, not to create anxiety, but to dissolve the unconscious assumption that those things are required for your peace. Third, social contribution as identity anchor. Studies on meaning and well-being consistently show that people who define themselves by contribution to others, not performance for others, contribution to them, report higher baseline life satisfaction. Relatedness, in DC and Ryan's model, is not about being liked. It is about genuine connection with a purpose beyond the self. The integrative path is not the easy path. It asks you to do something psychologically difficult, to act fully while holding outcomes lightly, to care about the work without depending on the reward for your sense of worth. Most people cannot do this because they were never shown that it was an option. They were handed the acquisitive map at birth and told it leads somewhere. It does, just not where they expected. Here is what I want you to take from this. The happiness trap is not that you want too much. It is that you have been chasing a feeling, using a strategy that biologically cannot deliver it long term. The acquisitive path promises arrival. The integrative path offers something quieter and far more durable, a self that doesn't collapse when circumstances change. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire and wrote in private about the irrelevance of empire to his peace. That is not contradiction. That is mastery. You don't have to choose between ambition and equanimity. You have to stop treating one as the source of the other. Next episode in the Mind Trap series, we go deeper into something most people use as a coping mechanism, but is actually one of the most sophisticated psychological traps in existence: the identity trap of being the person who suffers well. You think you've escaped the happiness treadmill. You haven't. You've just found a more respectable version of it.